Welcome to Cars on Call. I am automotive journalist, gastroenterologist Steve Schutz. I'm here with trauma surgeon Stephan Moran and automotive collector, connoisseur, historian Adam Hudson. We're all together. Guys, we got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about a little new Ford, which is kind of cool. Car spotting. Adams, you have a really unusual car spotting. Stephan's got some great safety. Stephan, it doesn't matter what you have. It won't be as moving as Julie Alt. That was really, really amazing. I mean, you could probably say a couple words about her, but amazing. Then we're going to talk 90s. So anyway, Stephan, before we move on, Julie Alt.
Yeah, that was a tremendous episode. I spoke with her again this week and we got a lot of feedback. She put the episode on her Facebook page and she got a tremendous outpouring of support from friends, people she hadn't heard from. And I talked with her and I said, we need to come up. The two of us need to kind of do this as a presentation, the speaker circuit. She's all about it. What I see this moving towards is like a big corporate event where they bring in a keynote speaker. And if you think about your number one asset in a company, corporation, are your people. And what's most likely to happen to your people? Motor vehicle collision. So, I mean, so from an accounting standpoint, if you're self-insured, the last thing you want to do is have an employee in a motor vehicle accident. You go to the ER, it's $40,000 after a car wreck. That is the entry point. You stay in the hospital for a while, you're looking at $1 million. So not only that, but loss of life and and time lost at work. So I think we could hit the circuit.
I don't want to pull you off of that, but also look at it. It says how the company cares about its people.
Yes.
Just being safe. I mean, Julie, I want you to roll with what you're saying, but I'm not kidding you. I had friends reach out to me. And first of all, I wanted to check out the episode because I was a little concerned that you guys hoping you were able to carry it without me. But
it was tough.
Oh my gosh. You guys together with her story, the sincerity in her voice. I had people who are car guys reach out to me on Facebook and say, that's one of the most moving things I've ever seen.
I was moved doing it with her. She got very moved as well. And I think it's a message to hear. And she was fabulous. I mean, she looked like a pro coming off the inspirational speaker circuit. Like she had done this 1,000 times. She was a former 911 operator and she talked to people 911. That was her job. So she knows how to convey a message, hold an audience captive, while they're calling 911. So I hope I can make this happen. I think get out there, I'm not saving lives, operating, taking care of trauma patients anymore, but if I can be preventative, I will get that same satisfaction. That's what I hope to get out of this podcast as well, is be preventative and maybe saving a life by somebody making that decision. That they
Folks, if you didn't see that episode, go back and tune it in. Show it to your whole family.
Yep.
Yeah, we, really the genesis of this podcast was to try to get people to learn about car safety from the perspective of a trauma surgeon. Well, my goodness, it never occurred to me that we could ever get somebody who's a survivor to come on the show, especially one who came so close to passing away.
Right. We did have Jack Roush, but that was an airplane crash, a different story. This is about automotive safety. Jack tells his story, but Julie was very moving and it was very serendipitous. She called me on the road, headed home. So that's episode 69. We've got on YouTube as well as regional podcasts. And I got to say, I think that's going to be one of the initial episode, our initial very first podcast was the highest number of hits, but I have a feeling that this episode with Julie is going to become our number one episode.
Yeah. I hope so. I hope so. For any listener, you learn a lot from that, and it's very moving. But the lesson is the same lesson, that is be safe, think safety. It's great. So I hope you guys go on the road, Stephan. It would be great. Moving on, as all listeners know, I talk about my local car dealership, which is right across the freeway from my office. So our office sits high and it looks down across the freeway, and I can see the lot in front of the car dealership very well, and I can count cars. And we made the point, this would have been about a year ago, They really didn't have vehicles. They had basically no F-Series trucks. They had a few Edges, a few Explorers, not much.
They had
But we made the point.
deposits.
Yeah.
What's that?
They had
They had
deposits.
deposits.
Yeah, and because of the supply chain, they couldn't supply these vehicles, and the supply chain problem has gotten better month by month. And I found it very interesting, just looking just a couple days ago, because you still have the same old plenty of Escapes, Explorers, Edges, Bronco Sports. You see a lot of those now. As pathologists say, it's TNTC. F-Series. TNTC is too numerous to count. F-Series, even Super Duties, lots of F-Series trucks, F-150s especially. There was one Bronco, it's the two-door, and that was kind of on display. You can't have either a Jeep or a Bronco or a Land Rover and not display it on a big rock. So one of the wheels was up on a rock, which I think is kind of silly.
Gotta do it.
Okay, whatever. And so there's one of those. But interestingly, guys, there were 5 F-150 Lightnings lined up. These things, and I've heard the same thing about Mach-E's. Mach-E's are suddenly softening. You can get deals on them. They're not selling like they used to. It looks like the Lightnings aren't quite moving off the lots like they used to also.
You know, the Lightning's interesting to me. I'm not surprised at all. Of course, you know, brand new vehicle, people put down deposits, all the rage, you can't get one. But I own a truck, and I had my trailer out this weekend. I loaded up all my furniture that I make in my business and took it to a antique mall and renting a booth. You know, if you have an F-150 Lightning, you know, your towing mileage is like non-existent. So I think, you know, the reality of owning that thing, yeah, sure, great, it's electric, but the minute you start putting payload in that or start towing with it, all of a sudden that honeymoon of driving an EV just completely evaporates. So I'm not surprised. I think those are going to be people that want the look of driving something electric. They show up at the job site, but they ain't towing with it. They're not putting payload in it because they're not going to have the time to bother to figure out what's my range, you know? Yeah, you load up a load of rock and like, what? I can't make it home because now your range went from 300 miles to 75 because you got a $5,000 pound payload and you're pulling a 5,000 pound trailer. So
Or you can do the ultimate in irony, and part of your payload is a gas generator.
yeah.
I think that the F-150 Lightning is absolutely the perfect vehicle for the guy who has to always have 2 F-150s.
That guy.
Yeah, so he's got the F-250 diesel Super Duty, you know, and then he's got the Lightning.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's a fashion accessory more than it is a truck.
Yeah, so you two $100,000 trucks in your garage. I mean,
you know, I was going to mention that about the sticker price. You know, we've just gotten past sticker shock. You know, that used to be a phrase, and it used to be, and I don't know the number. Somebody probably out there, some economist sort of does, where your home at some point in the American evolution of the automobile might have been worth 6 or 8 times what your car was, what one car was, and now you've got these $80,000 and $100,000 vehicles occasionally parked in front of houses or properties that rival that price. And I'm not trying to make an economic statement here, but Lordy, how much can a person afford with the car payment with a $80,000 or $100,000 truck working a construction job? I'm not talking about the foreman and the GC, but you see them all over the place, and you wonder if the game of musical chairs and the Pied Piper is going to converge at mortgage car loan default. And I think we're seeing that in some of the numbers.
Yeah, car defaults have been rising for about 6 months. I've been reading about it. But Adams, these are very affordable vehicles. And you buy one, you take a 9 or 10 year loan, you're fine.
And there you go. And of course, for all of the 9 or 10 years, you are upside down. And that is,
yeah.
Isn't that called a mortgage?
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yes,
you know, I love it. People call vehicles an investment now. No, I'm sorry. No, that's a depreciating asset.
Yeah.
A
Yeah,
brand new
speaking-
vehicle is depreciating asset.
Speaking of, well said, Stefan. Speaking of depreciating asset, Adams, talk about your car spotting.
Oh, this was what a segue.
Yeah.
I actually saw a car that really is sort of a presage of what we're going to be speaking about later in the episode. There you go. Thank you. The Isuzu Impulse. This is probably a car some of the car on call faithful and even car folks are not super familiar with. This was a car that, Isuzu, who was, I think they started like back in 1912 or 1914, big industrial maker, made a bunch of trucks. And they started importing cars to the US. And at one point, boys and girls, Isuzu sold 125,000 cars in the United States alone back in '86.
Wow.
They decided they wanted to develop a little sporty edge, get away from just the pure utilitarian world. So they hire none other than Giorgetto Giugiaro, who's been mentioned on
Say
this.
that again, please. You can practice that.
You got to be on your third glass of Chianti to say that. Giorgetto Giugiaro, who designed such notable cars in the past. We've mentioned the VW Golf and Scirocco, which he designed, but also the Maserati Ghibli, the Lotus Esprit, the BMW M1 were all his designs. And this particular car that you're looking at was going to be an F-150. No.
You went through those cars too fast. You might think. Hey, listeners, we're trying to enter the 21st century here, and I'm supposed to be pulling up pictures but Adams is reeling them off so fast. I didn't know I was supposed to be pulling them up. Right, so let's stop here. All right, here we go. Here's your Maserati Ghibli.
Here's
here it is.
And this is why there you go.
There you go.
Oh,
From
and
the same designer. Okay.
Yeah. From blue, that's blue Chiaro. That's a beautiful color as well. Anyway, so yeah, same designer. So Isuzu is like, okay.
Oh, the Lotus Esprit. There it is.
There you go. Not all of them are submarines. That was an option.
We had to do submarine just because this is the week of the Titanic Titan.
Yeah.
Ocean Gate.
There we go.
There we go.
There you go. She said, you guarantee, I don't care what that girl weighs. Is that Karen Valentine?
No, it's Barbara Bach.
Okay, well, she cracked that hood. No question. Lotuses were made slightly more durable than eggs, but not much. I
had the biggest crush on Barbara Bach back in the 80s. Anyway, we'll move on.
Okay, all right. So the Isuzu Impulse, it was called the Piazza in Japan. And they sold okay. So they come over here, they're sort of kind of a decent looking style. And here's a very goofy thing Isuzu did. They designed this car for women. The controls, like for the HVAC, the fan control to increase it had an image of a lady with her hair blowing back. That was
what? I don't remember that.
That's how they indicated the face level vent, and the floor level vent was indicated, when you switch the dial to that, it just showed these stylish boots, like, a lady's boots. And so it was kind of designed for ladies, which of course sort of messed up. They were going down two roads at one time. They had a RS turbo, which is the one that I'd actually seen. That car had a 2-liter turbo, about 140 horse, which was decent for the day, rear wheel drive, semi-hideaway headlights. Again, that design that you saw, Recaro style seats, or actually designed by Recaro in the seats. And by 1989, since GM owned a good piece of Isuzu and all of Lotus, the handling was by Lotus. So it was
I remember that.
That was the badge. You remember, like they had the badge on the side of the car, and
I think it said handling by Lotus. I totally forgot it was rear wheel drive. All these years I thought it was front wheel drive.
Steve, until I looked at this, I thought it was front wheel
drive. Wait a minute, that car was rear wheel drive?
Rear wheel drive. Now they later went to front wheel, so we're all
I had no idea.
The first ones that you showed are rear, and then the next generation was front. They were GM. Trying to save money. That thing was plugged into a Chevrolet Chevette chassis that GM just had laying around by the scads. Wow. And so you think with that value proposition that they owned the companies and they already had these junky chassis sitting around that Lotus was able to do something with, You'd think it would have been a big seller, and it just kind of wasn't. And here's part of the reason. That car, at a time that the Acura Integra was like 11 grand, that car was 16 grand.
No.
Yes, sir. That the turbo, that was
Wow.
a price. They, people could not get over that, because actually the Impulse, like in that price category, the Impulse was in a whole different performance league. So the Impulse had no pulse with the cars that it competed against. So it didn't sell. And that was kind of like, that's where Isuzu was peaking. And then they just sort of rolled off the map. And by 2007, they were gone.
I remember
was
that car,
pretty
though.
close in price to the Accord. It may have been a little bit more than the Accord. Back in the mid 80s, late 80s, the best-selling vehicle in America was the Accord. The Camry had not taken over yet. Actually, it was a Taurus, but the Accord was way up there. There's no way you'd take an Impulse over an Isuzu over an Accord.
And you know something? I said Integra, I meant Accord. I think the Accord was in the 11, 12 grand range. Is that about right?
That sounds about right. There's no way you take. I mean, Stephan, you had two Accords? You'd never take one of those over an Accord.
No way. I saw. I mean, they were pretty cool when they came out, and they had, the Lotus badging on the side. But I was saying to them, like, I'm not spending that kind of money on an Isuzu. And what did Joe Isuzu or somebody, or who was that? What was that commercial?
That's right. Yeah, Joe Isuzu.
Joe Isuzu.
Anti-salesperson. He sort of said negative things. And
Right.
that car, like the photo you showed, Steph, had these like semi-hideaway headlights. I'm doing the hand motion like this. Like they were like eyebrows, and then you would turn them on and they'd go up about 2 inches. And that's all they did. But it was kind of trick. It was like the Lamborghini Urama.
Stellantis could have fixed that. I mean, Stellantis could have fixed the headlights if they only came up halfway.
Well, they only stay up for 4 hours, though.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's really cool, Adams. Isuzu had some good sales back in the 90s, or I'm sorry, the 80s, late 80s into the 90s, because they had the Trooper. The Trooper was very cheap, boxy SUV, emphasis on cheap. So where a Jeep Cherokee, which was really the best seller back then, would have been probably, I don't know, close to 20 grand, or maybe, I guess it would have been around 18 or so. The Trooper would have been like 12, a lot cheaper. It was unbelievably tinny. I mean, Stephan, the safety would have been the worst on the road, but it was cheap.
But yeah, it was really your first entry. If you wanted an SUV, you wanted all-wheel drive, that was really the point of entry. And they were actually very well built. I mean, they ran like tanks. They ran forever.
They did, and they kind of have that cool sort of look now, that people, I mean, they look like what they're trying to do, but they were so vertical and so narrow. They looked real tippy. I mean, I don't know why didn't they just put a sunroof in the floor? Because that thing's going upside down.
All right.
Here we go.
Thanks. You got a picture.
Yeah.
We'll
There we
show
go.
that.
Here's a Trooper for you.
That's
Nice.
it.
That's it.
To me, I mean, that thing looks like a child's drawing of what.
But also kind of looks like a Gen 1 Land Rover too.
Yeah.
The Land Rover just had higher sills on the sides.
And by the way, it seemed like 80% of them were that color.
Yeah. My friend, actually, Jimbo, who's a listener to this show, he had one that color, and we drove it around Europe. And he was very sad. I forgot if he got rid of that thing. I think he did. He was like, that was one. He said he should have never gotten rid of that thing, because it was a tank. It ran forever, and a ton of room in the back.
I feel like that car will be like a newer version of the International Scout. It's
Or the Jeep Wagoneer.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a retro cool.
The Scout was sort of languished in obscurity, and this car sort of did the same. But I mean, they are super durable. Absolutely. That's probably a coming collector car.
Dark horse.
I'm not going that far, Adams.
I'll go on record as going that far. I'd love to have one.
All right. Well, that's cool. Isuzu Impulse. And by the way, we just mentioned that the Trooper is not a safe vehicle, because it was very tinny. That's a good segue to Stephan. Stephan, give us your safety corner today.
All right, we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit, and I've talked about this before, but I'm going to combine two topics here. So some new stats have come out about 2022, and drivers in the United States killed more pedestrians in 2022 since 1981, any year prior. And this is in complete opposite direction of all the other industrialized nations around the country, Germany, France, Europe. The US, it is getting more and more dangerous for pedestrians in this country. And, you kind of guys start to ask yourself why. So to think about it, since 2010, pedestrian deaths have jumped 77%. Okay. And, that something's going on here. What's going on? What do we have to do to reverse this trend? So our roads have gotten dangerous overall. We've had 25% more traffic fatalities as well, related deaths in the last couple of years, but particularly for pedestrians. What can we do for pedestrians? It kind of made me think about when I was driving to Ireland. They had slow speed limits in city centers. Europe has what they call road calming. They put roundabouts everywhere. They let cars park halfway on the street. They put speed humps in. There are signs for pedestrians. And so Seattle kind of looked at this, and Seattle decided they needed to do something about this. And a third of crash deaths occurred on urban arterials in 2020. So the arterials are the feeders that come into the city. And they basically said, you know what? Higher speeds make crashes more likely. The driver doesn't have as much time to react to a pedestrian. So they've got less time to react. They've got less time to stop. We're going to drop the speed limits. So not only dropping the speed limit, do you have longer for the driver to react, you got more time for the pedestrian to react. And not only that, a lower speed means you've got less kinetic energy, meaning when you get hit by the car, you'd rather be hit by a car at 20 miles an hour than a car at 25, because remember, the kinetic energy is the square of the velocity. So it makes a big difference, small increases in velocity. So you increase the odds of injury. So what Seattle did was they lowered the speed limits on all the arterial feeders within downtown to 25 miles an hour from 30 and 35. And then in the residential and the smaller streets, they dropped the speed limits to 20. Now, Boston had tried this previously, and they only looked at speeding, and they found, yes, it caused decreased speeding, but they didn't look at the impact on crash and injury rates. They just assumed that, yes, if we drop the speeds, we're going to have less injury and crash, but they didn't look at that data. So the city did a big public outreach campaign telling everybody we're going to drop these speed limits. You can imagine how many signs they had to change. And they did it off highway ramps, arterials, ferry terminals. And one thing, talking about highway ramps, in Germany, on the Autobahn, they have unlimited areas. They have areas of 140, but all the speed limits are reduced at all entry exit points on the interstate. Very smart. You've got people merging, coming on. You don't want people going fast there. So they did this big outreach, and they found that, as you would expect, crashes went down, injuries went down. And within 3 years, they saw a statistically significant decrease. And this is true primarily for the arterial roads. On the smaller roads, they saw decreases, but they weren't statistically significant. So what they see, a 17% drop in the odds of an injury crash downtown, and then a non-significant 7% drop outside the city centers. A 17% drop in the odds of an injury crash. That's close. That's very close to 1 in 5 reduction. That's a big time reduction. If you're the pedestrian crossing the road, that makes a big difference to you. So, and I got to thinking about this. Would you rather cross the street as a pedestrian when the speed limit's 45, 35, or 20? It's kind of scary standing there at a pedestrian crossing, and you're there 2 feet from the curb, and the cars are doing 35, 45, 55, 60. So think about where you have pedestrian crossings. Yeah, the speed limits should be slow, because there can be people that go across a little bit late, a little early. There's going to be jaywalkers. So very interesting study that showed, speeding in the wrong places. I've talked about this is bad. You're driving through a neighborhood, just slow it down. Okay. Kids coming down sidewalks, school zones, of course, you need to slow down. But if you see a lot of pedestrians and you're driving in the city, just slow it down, because, somebody's going to step out They're going to think they get time to go. Pedestrians are walking around with their phones. They're not paying attention. We've all seen the videos on YouTube of people walking in the fountains, walking in the signpost. So pedestrians are distracted. And I think this is a wonderful study that shows, yep, slow it down. We're going to save pedestrian lives. Because, the other big thing that I've mentioned briefly, I'm not going to go a lot of detail, but with the predominance in the United States of SUVs and pickup trucks, you stand no odds as a pedestrian, because what happens is you take that full frontal force across your pelvis and your chest. If you get clipped by a car, you're going to roll up on the hood. You're going to have longer time to slow down, roll off the back. But, you get hit by a Suburban. I mean, you're going he's doing 30 miles an hour. You go from 0 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour instantaneously, because you are going to be, and then we'll talk about this later on. And if you're hit by an SUV, not only are you going to be struck, you're going to be run over. If you're hit by a car, you're going to bounce off, roll over the hood, off the windshield. If you're hit by an SUV, you're going to bounce forward, you're going to get run over.
Hey, Stephan, let me ask a couple questions. Well, one is, I guess, is a point. I read about this when the movie Manchester by the Sea came out, and it's about basically an accidental death, but how even if it's not your fault, you're affected profoundly by it. And this whole area of what's called accidental impact, there's a website, and a woman started this whole movement to be aware of this. And she said she was driving the speed limit down a regular road, and a kid came out on a bike, no crosswalk, and she hit him and killed him. Oh. And she said, everybody said, it's not your fault. And she said, I know it's not my fault, but it was my car, and I hit a child, and I hit a child and I killed him. That was her point. It doesn't matter.
Right. It doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, your life is just horribly changed.
Exactly. So your whole point about if we can make the roads calmer and slower, and that way, even if a kid does something stupid on his bike, which kids do, then the impact is much less.
Exactly. She'd been doing 20 miles an hour. If the speed limit had been 20 or 15 in a residential area, the kid would have survived. Yeah, more than likely. Now if she'd have been driving a passenger vehicle versus an SUV, the big difference. I tell people, if you're gonna, you're gonna be driving a monster SUV, Hummer, F-150 like I have, you hit somebody, they're not gonna do very well. There's a lot of mass, a lot of energy, a lot of frontal impact. Very different than sedan versus sedan. So
there's a couple things you mentioned there, Stephan. We always appreciate your input here on this topic. I mean, the 77% increase since 2010 has still sort of got me baffled. But
it's awful.
It's just staggering. And I tell you, not terribly long ago, I had a flat in the Cayenne that's not behind me, but outside. I had a flat on the interstate, pulled off. And when you're going 70 miles an hour and everybody's going to 70, you feel like, I'm kind of like loafing along. Maybe you do 75, or you creep up to 80 every now and then. You just feel like you're sort of cruising. It's quiet, it's comfortable, you're having a normal conversation. Man, when you're on the side of that interstate and people whistle by at 70, they may as well be doing 300.
As you mentioned that, when I had the crash with the Bullet, when I hit the riprap on the interstate, I parked my car, and I parked at the end of a bumper on the right side, and I went and I stayed behind the bumper. It was absolutely frightening. There'd be two semi trucks coming side by side, and the people that were in the Chrysler 300 next to me that hit the riprap, they stopped in front of me. They stayed in their vehicle. I'm like, I told them, y'all need to, I would not stay in that vehicle. I said, people get killed on the side of the road all the time. And, listeners, if you're going down the interstate and you see a car half a mile down the road, get in the left-hand lane, man. Slow it down. I mean, some kid may open that door. They may come around the side, and literally you are 4 feet from them, 3 feet from them, doing 70 miles an hour.
Yeah. For our non-Southern listeners, riprap is a large rock. Nobody knows what riprap is, Stephan. Outside of Alabama.
I mean, come on, riprap.
Time in jail,
So before we move on, very quickly, Stephan, I had a friend point something out that I don't know if this is true or not. It does make sense. He said, you think drunk driving is dangerous. Drunk walking is really dangerous.
I can imagine. Yeah. Big city. Yeah. People, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, hey, moving on, I read something interesting. So we talked back in March about how Dark Side of the Moon turned 50. And at our age, Dark Side of the Moon turned 50. We're like, yeah, sure, 1973, 50 is a long time ago, but yeah, it makes sense. But I think everybody will be surprised, even listeners, to know that in 1993, which was 30 years ago, Dr. Dre's The Chronic came out. And The Chronic is now 30 years old. We all think of that's like modern hip hop music, and it's 30 years old, which is right, guys. I mean, like, that's a long time ago.
It's still influential music, which makes it seem a little more relevant and fresh. But yeah, 30 years, man, that's 3 decades, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
Well, 1 score plus 10.
1 score plus 10. Thank you for our Civil War enthusiasts.
Yeah, written in quill pen over there.
Oh my gosh. The things that Cabernet says. Anyway,
I brought my cup from Blake Shelton.
1 score. All right. So 1 score 10 years ago, Dr. Dre's The Chronic came out, and the 90s were very influential. And I read an article recently in Motor Trend, and it talked about some of the trends that started in the 90s that we still feel the effects of today. And they basically said the 90s were when everything changed. I think they really did have a point. We've all dug into this, and we've got our own kind of take on this, a cars on call take. And Stephan, I know you're going to touch on safety here too, but there were some big trends that happened in the 90s. It started in the 90s. We talked about the 70s. We talked about the 80s. I think in music and in automotive, the 90s does not get nearly the amount of respect and credit that it deserves. So we're going to talk about a few of these trends. And Stephan, we'll start with you. It's when family sedans, which we grew up with, family sedans were it. That's what you had when you were a family. Maybe a station wagon, but a station wagon is it's a shooting brake, as you call it, Stephan. It's a sedan with a back on it. But the 90s is when things started to change and family sedans began to die and SUVs started to rise. Stephan, you looked into this. That was a big deal.
Yes, I'll look back at it. It kind of came on us slowly, and it started with, the Explorer and the SUVs, and then people liked them. They kind of replaced the station wagon. Then we had the crossovers, then we had the compacts. And of course, nobody wanted to see driving a minivan. But what's very interesting was, so the Camry and the Accord are always in the top sellers, but the sedans just started to slowly dwindle and die away. And what was interesting to me was that if you look at today, the Camry, which is once the #1 selling vehicle, always behind the F-150, but Camry today is #9 overall. And here's what's crazy. The Model 3 Tesla is right behind it at #10. But I couldn't even believe this. The Model Y is #4 on sales. Okay.
Yeah.
And the Model Y, but I look at these compact crossovers.
Makes me ask why, but
Why?
Sorry. I had to throw that in. It looks like a drowning catfish, but continue.
I was going to tell you. So for me, the Model Y is #4, and this is just kind of what started in the 90s. The sedans went away, but if you look at the Model Y and I look at these crossovers, to me, they're just Boulat sedans. You know what Boulat means?
Do not.
I'm afraid to ask.
Boulat is a term we use for our trauma patients if they got really sick in ICU, and we gave them all these fluids. It means blowed up like a toad. So they get all Boulat. They look like the Michelin Man. So we call it Boulat.
That's pretty good.
I was waiting for a lesson here.
No, I came up with that Boulat. They Boulat, man. And it's just like DRT did right there. But so all these crossovers, to me, they're just Boulat sedans. And they have replaced the sedan with more headroom, a higher seating position. But typically there's no more trunk room, because they're just the way they're designed. So you haven't gained a lot of space, but it puts people up higher. So it's very interesting to me. And in the 90s, when Ford spent $3 billion to try to make a sedan to keep up with the Camry. That was the Ford Taurus. And, you know, they spent $3 billion. They didn't get anywhere with it. It really didn't. They lost a lot of money. And I'm going to show you a picture, and you can look at this and you'll see, well, I now understand why they lost money. I mean,
Well, the first one was very successful. That actually back in the 80s was successful. Second gen was even
Right.
more successful.
they
But
did sell a lot,
the 96 version is when they really, everything just fell apart.
but they spent a lot of money trying to catch up with the Camry. And in essence, the Camry itself was dying. It was slowly becoming extinct from the crossovers and SUVs. But, you know, out of the 90s, you know, we talk about the death of the sedan, but there were a couple cool things that happened in that time. We had the rebirth of the Roadster. We had the Miata, which spawned the SLK and the BMW Z3. And then the other thing that we saw, there were also another fails. Remember Dodge Neon trying to take the Corolla? That was a complete fail. But Mercedes-Benz started to manufacture SUVs in Alabama, the ML. So we think of the 90s as the death of the sedan, but there's this sudden birth of a new whole industry. The unitized body SUVs started. We had the Roadsters were reborn after having been gone for a long time. And then in Japan, during the death of the sedan is when the Prius was started in Japan. And it came over years later. So we think of the 90s as GM did fail with the EV1. Okay, that was a disastrous thing for them with lead acid batteries. But it was an interesting time. And I looked at it that, yeah, it was the death of the sedan, a big movement in the auto industry. But there were some cool sparks and things that came out of that time as well.
You know that you mentioned a lot of things that were sort of ending and beginning, and I think
Yes.
that's why the 90s. You know, we don't look at it. Everybody loves to call the 80s the malaise era, but you know, the 90s was really almost the hangover from the malaise era. But people started seeing it almost a little bit, and I don't want to make this too philosophical, but post Dark Ages to Renaissance, people started waking up to new ideas then because they were mildly desperate. I mean, the
Yes.
80s dealt a lot of legislative blows to car manufacturers and think, you know, society was shifting. And I hadn't really forgotten this. I almost said, hey, I forgot about the Miata, but the Miata started in 1989 or 90. I don't remember their launch year, but had it not been for the Miata, there wouldn't have been a SLK, there wouldn't have been an M Roadster, and there wouldn't have been a Boxster, which saved that company. There was
And a
lot-
Chrysler Crossfire.
Oh God! Getting
I
all
think
misty
that
eyed here.
I think that you know, we're a couple weeks ago I talked about maybe the most significant vehicle of the last 30 years, and I'll mention it again. But I
What,
think
Crossfire?
yeah, the Crossfire, sure. No, I think no, seriously. There was a big bang in the topic you're going to talk about, Adams. Well, there was a big bang in this topic too, Stefan. And for me, the big bang was the 1990 Ford Explorer, because you had a sedan or a station wagon or a minivan, and nobody was really happy with any of those. Probably that's the era when we started to have more stuff. You know, kids and babies, you know, you were going to soccer and all this stuff, and parents were driving their kids more. So I think you needed more stuff. The Explorer was a big bang. The Explorer came out and all of a sudden everybody had to have an Explorer. It was unbelievably popular. And I think that's the big bang with the Explorer was when people said, hey, we don't need a sedan or a station wagon anymore. And we don't have to be embarrassed by driving a minivan. We can have something that's cooler and it's better for our families. And once the Explorer came out, I think all doors opened.
It was like the original Jeep Cherokee at the same time too.
Exactly. And the Cherokee, I guess, predated it just a little bit, but it just didn't have the marketing muscle that Ford had. And Ford took a mediocre truck. I mean, it was an okay truck, but they took that platform, like Steve mentioned on the platform sharing issue, or that the Explorer was 20 times better than the Ranger that it was based upon. And that thing, it was everywhere overnight. That was a big bang. There you go.
Yeah.
I liked the Cherokee way more than the Explorer back then.
I think in retrospect, I agree with you, but I think what families were looking for at the time, like Steve was saying, I mean, that was really the emergence of the soccer mom. She was driving that Explorer. She could get it serviced.
Absolutely.
You know, it was all over the place. The best thing about that is the near Mustang R wheels. I love that.
Yeah, the Explorer, my wife and I, when we had our two first kids, we had a Cherokee, and I actually would rather have had an Explorer. We bought it before there was an Explorer, but the Explorer was about 20% bigger. And that 20% does, make a difference if you've got kids and a dog and that kind of thing. So anyway, moving on, another trend, which Motor Trend didn't really talk much about, but I'm going to talk about it, and that is pickups as daily drivers. And, before the 90s, the idea that you would have a pickup as a daily driver was just not a thing. If you were a construction worker, you had some legitimate reason, you were a plumber, that kind of thing, you had a pickup truck. But if you didn't, you didn't. And all of a sudden, by the way, coincidentally, that's when you had the birth of Lowe's and Home Depot. And now all of a sudden DIY became a thing. So instead of, and also people had higher standards. It used to be when we were kids, you had a house and you had a couple of bushes, you had a couple of trees, and then the kid would mow the lawn. And then starting in the 80s, but mostly into the 90s with Lowe's and Home Depot, it became a thing to have bark and mulch and kidney-shaped shapes on your lawn and flower beds and things like that. Your landscaping, the landscaping standards became higher, and all of a sudden, you kind of had to have a pickup truck to go to Home Depot to get your petunias. So, yeah. And then leave that up, Stephan. In 1997, the 10th generation, 1998 Ford F-150 came out. And that was the first pickup truck, full-size pickup truck that was approachable. It wasn't square and trucky. That was the first one that Ford deliberately designed with women in mind. You were talking about the Isuzu Impulse. Well, this is a pickup truck designed with women in mind. It was much softer looking, much more approachable than the old work trucks. And this truck was a gigantic success. By the way, it was the first full-size pickup that was a half-ton that had a crew cab. And just to give you some numbers.
That is a handsome looking vehicle.
It is.
In 1988, Ford sold 588 452, so about 590,000 pickup trucks. In 1998, they sold 840,000. A huge increase. That was a record for them. Obviously, that works. So this whole thing of like pickup trucks as daily drivers became a thing. Stephan, you have a pickup truck as a daily driver.
Yeah, I do. I love it.
So anyway, they became more nice inside. They were more, I don't want to say feminine, but they were more comfortable inside, better air conditioning. The Toyota Tacoma was introduced in 1995. I don't know if you have a picture of that. And Ford and Chevy and everybody just kind of followed suit. And while the F-150 with its more approachable design would be something that maybe a 40-year-old couple would have as a daily driver, the Toyota Tacoma, that's like a 25-year-old dude or even girl would have as a daily driver. This was a real big change.
It was
about, go ahead, Adams.
Well, I'm just socially and like the way people were changing in society. I never really thought about the rise of the DIY with the Lowe's and the Home Depot sort of paralleling and then almost creating the need for the showable truck. I never really thought about that, but that's true. And that Tacoma that you're showing right there, I remember almost being disheartened around that time, somewhere in the 90s, where the number one choice of the high school student on what car to have, which for us, it would have been radically different. The small pickup truck was like the second most popular choice. They were filling up high school parking lots. That's what the 16-year-olds wanted.
Well, it's cool to, back then you think about it, the American manufacturers' vehicles weren't that reliable. The Fords and the GMs, fix it or repair it daily, for Ford. And but the Japanese came in, entry-level Accords, Civics. They were reliable cars. The Corollas were great. So yeah, you really didn't want an American pickup, but the Japanese come in with a smaller pickup that you know is going to have the reliability, yeah, I'll go for that. So it was just a marketing, and they also did it from the chicken tax perspective as well. I mean, they were trying to save money bringing smaller trucks, but it was a perfect marketing movement on them point, because nobody really needs an F-150 except for a small selection. I don't need an F-150 daily for what I do, even with my businesses. A Ranger, a Maverick would probably be fine the majority of the time. I only need that F-150 when I'm really towing 3,000 to 5,000 pounds or putting 5,000 pounds of payload in the back, which happens on occasion. But these things were perfect. And they hit the market right.
I think you're right. And they got both ends of the market. And these trends, obviously, Tacomas are huge sellers, and so are all the full-size pickups. So Adams, I find your topic fascinating too, because the way I look at it is the rise of luxury cars and the move into the mainstream, to me, maybe the most important, at least financially, trend since the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, all of them are, and until you launched this topic, Steve, I'd never really considered how influential the 90s was. It was really the hinge upon a lot of things, the hinge of things that we now see the full fruition of. Back in the day, there was, like, when you thought about luxury prior to the 90s, you thought about, in the US, you thought about Cadillac and Lincoln, and maybe the occasional Chrysler Imperial, but they sort of gave up. Look at that big boat. Yeah, they cornered the chrome market with that thing. And then, you that's what you would think about. But like that's if people were wealthy, they would have one of those. But if they were super wealthy, they would have a Mercedes Benz. And that wasn't just a step up. That was like 2 to 3 steps up. We did not even see Mercedes in our town until like the 300Ds started sort of trickling in, because they were affordable and they lasted forever, sometime around the mid 80s or late 80s. But then the emergence of a conspicuous consumption, another sort of term about how people went from not wanting to display their wealth to really wanting to display their wealth, which, like, if you look at the movie, Kirk Douglas movie, Wall Street, just take a look at that movie and bang, that's what was cooking at the time. And so about the time, now Acura had already been launched. That's back when Honda was a lot more bold than they are now. That's a different topic. But they popped off and created a separate brand with Acura, which was an upscale Honda. I mean, that's just what you would call it. But then I think, a lot of times we talk about this mythical cocktail party where the CEOs hang around and come up with brilliant ideas and then they share them all. Toyota and Nissan got together. There you go. Thank you for that image. And decided, hey, we're going to go upscale, because the Mercedes was so danged expensive. And you had BMW sort of emerging as the sort of youthful alternative to a Mercedes. Audi was way farther back in the pack. But then Toyota decided, we're going to come out with a reliable, good looking, well screwed together, well engineered car that would compete with the German brands, but be priced barely more than the American brands, which, let's just face it, I mean, we're all Americans and go America and red, white, and blue, and we want this to have not been the case. But GM and Ford were lagging horribly behind, especially GM. Their platform sharing and badge engineering was kind of a joke compared to what Toyota and Nissan did. Nissan launched the Infiniti, not as successfully, but still. So now you've got these upscale brands. And so BMW, Mercedes, and then by this time, Audi were going, oh my gosh, look what the Japanese have done. And they start bringing their accessibility more to the masses with lesser priced cars, the smaller, more approachable versions. And suddenly there's this convergence. The European brands are getting less expensive. The Japanese brands are getting dramatically more desirable and a little bit of a statement of status. And poor old GM, sort of like way back there, they used to be in second place, then it was third, then it was fifth, then it was sixth. And that's what happened. And all these stars crossed together right there in the 90s.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it was an interesting time. And I'll never forget one of the residents where I did my internship back in 90, I graduated medical school, what year, 87, 88. He pulled up, he bought the new white, he had a white LS400. And he drove that thing up to the ER ramp, and we were like, all of us were like, oh my God, that's just unbelievable. That LS400 when it came out, that was a complete game changer.
It's funny you mentioned the white. When I had a good friend of mine owned a landscaping company, by the way, and he was super successful, did very well. He deserved every success he got. But he bought his wife as sort of a reward for having done well. And she was with him during the leaner times as a brand new car. And he lived out in the country. He would not be a first choice of this type of car. You'd have thought it'd been a Cadillac. He bought her a white LS400. And when I saw that, I thought, that's about the best looking new car I've ever seen in my life.
With the tan interior.
Yep.
It was absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, the launch of Lexus was the big bang, and Infinity to a lesser extent, but they both launched in 1989 as 1990 models. That was the big bang, just like the Explorer was a big bang for SUVs as family vehicles, and the 1997, 98 rather, F-150 was the big bang for trucks as daily drivers. That Lexus, yeah, Stephan, it looks good in white.
It looked great. I like the tan interior. This one has gray on cars and bids. Oh, look at that, sold for $7,000. I mean, that's a bargain.
And it only had 104,000 miles. It used to be 100,000 miles back in the days we were talking about. Pre-90s was the death knell. That car's barely broken in.
No.
Yeah, that car will go. Matt Farah of Smoking Tire had a Lexus LS400 that he actually gave it to lots of people to drive around because he wanted to go to 1 million miles, and he did. So those cars really go forever. To me, I think about this in that when we were kids, if you had a Mercedes, you were rich. If you had a Cadillac, you were almost rich. I mean, that was the way it was, period.
If you had a Lexus, you were smart.
Yeah, but I mean, when we were kids, it was before there was Lexus.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the way it was. And if you had a Mercedes, you were rich. Now it is not surprising to see a Mercedes GLA parked outside of a trailer park or near a double wide.
That is so true. I never really thought about it in those terms. Man, that is a dramatic shift.
Hey, by the way, Adams, I don't know what you think about this, but there was another couple things that happened in the late 90s, which I think is absolutely not coincidental. I think that the Germans, the Germans that were paying attention said, okay, as Mercedes becomes more accessible and BMW and then Audi, with the rise of Audi, as the Germans became more accessible, and of course Lexus became very accessible to the middle class, we need to go higher. And Volkswagen, of course, famously bought Bentley, came out with, Stephan, your favorite car, the Continental GT. That was designed, that came out in the late 90s. Well, it was bought in 1990, I think came out in 2001. But it was like the most expensive Mercedes plus about 25%. And that was the goal. BMW bought Rolls-Royce, and Mercedes came out with Maybach. So they realized we're like too democratic. We have to get another brand that goes higher.
And, then they brought out your favorite car, Steve, the VW Phaeton.
I love that car. I know
you do.
I drove two of them, the V8 and the W12. I love them both.
If it kills us.
I didn't buy one, though.
All right. Well, you're right. They did kind of go upscale to the upscale. That's exactly right.
When you think about the Germans were, the English with Rolls-Royce and with Bentley, that was for a long time the epitome of the rich gentleman's driver's car. The Bentley was, the Bentley boys. And so very smart move on the Germans in capturing, Germans were making great sedans as well, but there's a certain panache, je ne sais pas quoi, with the Bentley or Rolls that nobody else in the world can carry that name. And yeah, we drive, I got the Mercedes 600. I've got a Bentley. Oh, excuse me. Oh, you got a Bentley. The Rolls is out back. So, I mean, that just has not gone away. And Range Rover has preserved that English coach built taste with interiors. And Range Rover, Jaguar, unfortunately, is fading from that fast. They're just dying on it. But Range Rover, Bentley, and Rolls, I think those are nameplates that have been guided so well, even under German ownership. They've maintained what is English about that it is the finest coach work and the finest interiors, and for Bentley's sake, combined with some performance. That's why Bentley Continental Super Sports has just always been an aspirational dream car of mine that I just love it. I'll never have one, but it will always remain at the top of my list for a GT car.
You know, that's something you mentioned a nameplate that I don't think about a lot. I mean, I've never owned one. I see them all the time, but the Range Rover somehow straddled all of this.
Yes.
They were hyper utilitarian in England or just in Europe. I mean, they were the farm vehicles that you would beat up and you would put your barbed wire and bales in the back, or you would go shooting from them and you would muddy them up. And somehow they pop off in the US about this time that we're talking about, late 80s, and then really became emergent in the 90s as a luxury version of that. So they did the both somehow.
Dude, Adam, have you ridden in a Range Rover? Have you been in a full-on Range Rover? It's like there's nothing like it in my mind. I think it is the ultimate S-class in comfort. You're up high, it's large, it's got capability. It's just the luxury inside is second to I'm a huge fan of Range. If I could afford a Range Rover, I'd own one. I love them. I've got two friends that have them, and even my wife Ellen, she got them when she's like, "This is nice." I'm like,
they're super good looking. I don't want to ride in one because I'm afraid it won't be a round trip.
No, you honestly, you need to ride. I mean, I know you've got a Cayenne, a little sporty, but you need to ride in a Range Rover. I understand why they sell like they do. I love them.
Well, plus a lot of mechanics kids through college. Go ahead.
I would say a couple of things. I completely agree with Stephan. They're very aspirational. I would say they're a work of art now. They're absolutely beautiful. It's like a rolling sculpture, number one. And then number two, they address the reliability. Their engine and transmission now are BMW.
Yep.
But there was a time, Steve-O, that they used that 4.4 liter V8, I believe. Now you correct me if I'm wrong, and it was not a reliable vehicle.
Oh, no, it was bad.
That's true, but that would have been 20 years ago when BMW bought Rover, and then they stuck their I think it was a 4.4 into the Range Rover. But that was it was a new engine back then. Now it's much more reliable. The new V8s that BMW has all over the place, including in the under the hood of a Range Rover, very reliable. Transmission's reliable.
And I agree with you. It's one of the prettiest vehicles on the road.
I absolutely love the full size. I mean, the sport's okay, but for me, the full size Range Rover, every iteration, Series 1, they've always they just nailed it. I love that vehicle.
So listeners, look what happened 30 years ago up to now. I mean, almost everything
yeah.
you mentioned really had like a seed of its beginning. Some things went away, some things began, but a lot of it, we owe a heck of a lot to the whole decade of the 90s.
Yep.
Very well.
All right. That was great. We're out of time. So Stephan, close us out.
Hey, listeners, listen, subscribe, please leave comments, tell your friends about us. This is a money losing affair, but we love what we do. So we do appreciate your comments, and we'd like to grow this podcast.
If you could just
be safe out there.
That'd be good.
Yeah. Buckle up, be safe, and we'll catch us next week. All right. See ya.